Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
I mean, the architect was either a certified genius or an authentic wacko.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten, recording from the podcast studio at Bag End. And as always, I'm joined by Chad Gross. He's recording from the corner table at the Prancing Pony. How you doing, Chad?
Pretty good. It's a little noisy in here. I did get everybody to be quiet because I bought them a pint. So everybody settled in and listening. And so this is kind of a live podcast from the Prancing Pony. I'm really excited. I'm excited to get back into interview mode after our first deep dive.
We're going to be interviewing Eric Johnson. But before we get to that, I want to tell our listeners about sort of a cool little interview. I'm 2/3 of the way through. You know how I like Dr. Peter Kreeft?
Yes.
Well, check out his interview with Matt Fred on the Pints with Aquinas podcast. There's a YouTube video of it, which I'll link in the show notes as always. It's entitled Morality, the Lord of the Rings, and Awkward Jokes with Dr. Peter Kreeft. It's 3 hours long, but they're sitting across from the table from each other, and it's very casual and nice, relaxed pace. I just love listening to Peter Kreeft. I mean, it's a lot of variety of topics. He's 85 years old, but he's still like absolutely sharp with like lots of insights. He talks about how he met his wife and talks about marriage, talks about just a whole bunch of topics, which is it's really enjoyable. I'm not even all the way done with it because it's like I can't sit down for 3 hours to watch that, but I've just kind of been taking it when I've had the chance.
Sure.
I like that guy a lot. I think it's just a really enjoyable viewing. So if you're interested in that, folks, check it out on YouTube. It's in the show notes.
All right. Excellent. I actually started this week. I finished the gentleman's book that we're going to be interviewing today. And I started Paul Copan's book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? Really enjoying it. Very sharply written. And I have to confess, I had heard a lot of the different explanations of how Christians try to make sense of Old Testament violence, but I found some of them rather out there. So I'm looking forward to learning more as I go forth in the book.
That's the current reading these days. Check out all the good stuff in the show notes, but we want to go ahead and talk a little bit about our guest. His name is Eric Johnson. He's been studying Mormonism for over 40 years. That's impressive. He works full-time with the Mormon Research Ministry. You can find that at mrm.org. Mormon Research Ministry is a missionary/apologetics organization that was established in 1979 to propagate the gospel of Jesus Christ and to critically evaluate the differences between Mormonism and biblical Christianity. So Eric co-hosts the daily radio program called Viewpoint on Mormonism and writes for MRM's Mormonism Research newsletter. He's the author or co-author of a number of books addressing Mormonism, some of which we will mention in the interview today. Also see the show notes for a complete list and links to where you can find them online. In short, you can go to mrm.org for quick access to all the resources. They've got books, podcasts, videos, tracks, and other helpful tools. His latest book is called Introducing Christianity to Mormons, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. And you can find more about the book and other great resources at introducingchristianity.com. All right, let's go to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Okay, Eric Johnson, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Yes.
Great to meet you. Thanks for writing your most recent book here, Introducing Christianity to Mormons, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the interview. But Eric, way back in 1987, you went on an outreach to Utah. So talk about what happened on that trip, which started your ministry to Mormons.
I had been involved in another ministry called Making Disciples Ministry, where I lived in San Diego area. And so I had talked to Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, New Age, but I had never gone to Utah to do evangelism. So I decided to spend a summer doing that in 1987. And we did a lot of different things. It was really good for me to have the experience of talking to people who, in this state, 50 to 60% on the average are LDS, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the official name of the church. And so doing everything from Pioneer Day, they have a parade. I was down there witnessing till 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, and going to Temple Square and talking to lots of people. We spent a lot of time at Temple Square, which is in the heart of the city where I live now in Salt Lake City, where the temple is, where they have the tabernacle and the conference center now across the street. Back then, they didn't have that. But we went to a tiny little town. If you put your finger on a map of Utah and put it to the very center, you would land on Manti, Utah. It's a town even today of just a few thousand people. And they have a pageant there every summer that we attended and witnessed at before the pageant out in the street and had good conversations. But we did door to door. And I know that's not something that a lot of people like to do, but it can be very scary. But going door to door in Utah actually is not that hard because people are so friendly and so many people have been on missions. And so they serve a 2-year mission. Oftentimes the males and the females can serve a year and a half. That they welcome you in, and in this town, a lot of old people, and so we came to an old farmer's house. He might have been in his 70s or 80s. I can't remember exactly how old I thought he was, but he was old. And he and his wife took me into their home, and the companion that I was with, and we sat down and had a good conversation. But I ended up talking a lot and didn't listen as much as I should have. And I explained that in the introduction to the book because I want people to know that it's not going to be perfect every time. And I had already been witnessing before, but this was a good experience for me because as I left, I realized I talked over his head. This guy had never been out of past Salt Lake City. Manti is about a 2-hour drive. He had never been past there. He had never heard of Billy Graham. I remember asking him that question. His TV got 3 stations. It was a one chance perhaps this man had to hear the gospel. And I don't think I did a very good job. I felt that way. And so I made a promise to myself I would never be like that again. So I make lots of mistakes. Even today, I'll make mistakes, but I want to get better and better, and I want to be able to share what Christianity is all about.
Yeah. I hear many people that get into a certain thing simply because, well, they just stumbled and they made mistakes and they thought, well, I'm not going to make that mistake again. I'm not going to let that atheist get away without me having a good answer next time, that sort of a thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yesterday I was at the Utah Lighthouse bookstore run by Sandra Tanner. She's a pioneer in evangelism and research of Mormon history and studies. And so my friend Bill and I take turns manning the store. It's right across the street from the ballpark in Salt Lake City. And I had a couple come in. This couple, he had left in 2012. And I always can gauge when they walk in just where they're coming from. And so I was able to have a really cordial 45-minute conversation with he and his wife. Called himself an atheist. His wife says, no, he's not an atheist. Well, we talked about that. And when they come into that bookstore, they're on my territory. So I get to ask questions. I get to talk to them. And I tell you what they did, Brian and Chad. This couple took seriously the things that I was saying, and they admitted they needed to do a better job of understanding what other faiths were all about. And he promised he was going to do some research on Christianity. He had never done that. He left in 2012. That's 10 years ago. And he just says, I got so burned out. I realized for a lot of Latter-day Saints who do leave, they don't have any desire to jump right into another religion because they think that this is going to be the same thing. And to be able to explain what Christianity is, the reality of it, and not cater to the straw man arguments that Mormons like to make about our faith. They have all kinds of false ideas about what we believe. I think a good presentation needs to be made, not only understanding what Mormonism teaches, but understanding what Christianity has to offer. And if we have something that is irresistible because God does exist, because Jesus did come to this earth to be able to live as a man, but he's God in the flesh and we can have a relationship with him. So it's a whole revolution from what happened in 1987 to 2022, and just being able to hear them and listen to them and engage them. It's just been years of practice, and you don't get good at it overnight, but you can really learn how to be effective because we're in sales. Okay. I have an advertising degree from San Diego State. We're in sales, but God's in production. If I do my part, God can get glorified through that, but I can't make anybody become a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I like that.
All right. Well, before we get into the interview, I will be asking Eric a question about Mormonism and the Chosen towards the end of the interview. So if you're interested in hearing that, keep listening. So go ahead.
Eric, before we get into your latest book, Introducing Christianity to Mormons, I thought it would be helpful for listeners if you could just give us kind of a brief sketch. And I know this is a lengthy topic, but just If somebody is listening and they're saying, what is a Mormon? What is Mormonism? Could you give kind of just a brief sketch of what Mormonism is?
Well, in a brief way, and by the way, they don't like to use the word Mormon anymore or Mormonism because in 2018, the leader of this church, 17th President Russell M. Nelson, had I guess you would say, a revelation from God at night telling him Jesus said that he was offended whenever that was used. And so you're not supposed to use that anymore. They had a great marketing name. Mormon.org was their website, LDS.org. They don't have those anymore. They just forward to Church of Jesus Christ.org. So I just thought I'd mention that right there. They believe, according to the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, that Mormonism is the restored gospel, that all of Christianity died soon after the death of the apostles. And it wasn't until a man named Joseph Smith came along and in 1820, as a 14-year-old boy, was appeared to by God the Father and Jesus out in the woods near his home in New York, upstate New York. And he was told that all the churches were wrong and all their creeds were an abomination. A few years later, he gets a visit from what was called, it was called the Angel Moroni. And this was a human being back in the 5th century AD and was a Nephite. There's two people groups according to Mormonism. The Book of Mormon teaches in Nephites and Lamanites. And he came to give these gold plates to Joseph Smith. And so Joseph Smith translates these plates over the next few years. And in 1830 starts this religion with 6 people. The religion teaches doctrines that are contrary to biblical Christianity, because Mormonism does deny or distort every fundamental teaching of the historic Christian church. As far as who God is, Mormonism teaches that God has a body of flesh and bones, that he has not always been God, that he once was a human in another world, that he worshiped his own God, and then that God had worshiped his God, and so forth. And that Mormonism teaches that you can become a God with your family together if you do all the things you're supposed to, and you go to the temple and get sealed for time and eternity when you get married. And there's special things you have to learn in there to do that. Jesus is a spirit brother of Lucifer. He was created. He has not always been God. They deny the Trinity. They believe that the Bible is true only as far as is translated correctly. They do have 3 other scriptures, the Book of Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price, and the Doctrine and Covenants. Those are just a few things. Salvation, I'll give you one more. Salvation, according to Mormonism, is twofold. One is the idea that all people once lived in the spirit world, they call it, called pre-existence before this life, and that Jesus and Lucifer contended for being the savior of the world. Jesus won because he was the firstborn, and therefore all of us who chose Jesus were given the chance to have a body, and we get to go to one of 3 kingdoms of glory. 1/3 of our brothers and sisters in this pre-existent state were cast out of heaven. They were told that, or they are the demons, is basically what that turns out to be. They're not going to be able to ever have a body. And so salvation for Mormonism is general, and then there's individual, which is called exaltation or celestial glory. And the true salvation, full salvation, would be that you would actually keep all the commandments of God continually, and then you'll be able to enter into his presence where your family will be together, and then you will be able to do what God the Father did. I know that was kind of a long explanation, but I think you can see right off the top, there are a lot of differences.
Wow.
Honestly, when I asked the question, when I was thinking of the questions I wanted to ask you, when I kind of wrote that one down, just thinking through, I thought, man, that one's going to be interesting to see how he answers that, because it is difficult to summarize. So I actually think that was really good. This kind of follows from what you just said. Recently, I was really surprised. There were some prominent atheists on Twitter. They made quite a ruckus by claiming that Mormons were Christians, or simply another denomination of Christianity. And you can imagine a number of Christians kind of pushed back on that. What would you say to the atheists right now if they were listening and they were to try to make that argument to you, that they were trying to just say, look, they're just as much of Christian as you are in a traditional sense? How would you respond to that?
That is a common argument used by Latter-day Saints in the last 30 years or so, I would say, having been around this for a while. Back in the old days, though, they liked to be called Mormons. They used to cherish having that differentiation made because they did not want to be associated with biblical Christianity. But it hasn't been so popular to get into homes. And I'm going to say in the last 30 years, they became more politically correct. Mormon missionaries coming to our doors. They found a good way to get in was to talk spiritual things, to use the same language we use. And that's part of the problem, too, is we have the same vocabulary. We use salvation by grace. We use God. We use Jesus. And they would agree with all those things, but they have different meanings to them. Christianity traditionally and historically has had a particular meaning. Followers of Christ and the Bible has been the centerpiece. And you could make an argument, well, maybe it wasn't so much during, the first 1500 years, but certainly since the Protestant Reformation, the Bible becomes the point where if you differ with that, then we're going to disagree. And so if Mormonism does, as I explained earlier, deny or distort all of the teachings that the Bible has, and they do take verses, they certainly have proof texts they'll use to support their view, but they're always taken out of context or used in a way that was never intended by the original author. That is going to be a problem. And so I don't mind if a Latter-day Saint wants to be known as a Christian, all power to him. And I don't go up to people and say, well, you're not a Christian, because that gets in a ping pong match back and forth. But at the same time, if we're going to have a distinction made, Mormonism is not just another denomination, and I doubt most Mormons are going to want to be known as another denomination of biblical Christianity. They really, down heart, know that they are the one true church on the face of the earth. That's what Joseph Smith said, and that's what has been taught very regularly. So I deny that Mormonism is the same as Christianity, and so we have to distinguish. And so if you don't want to be known as Mormons or Mormonism, come up with something else. Maybe call yourself a Mormon Christian, I guess, and you can have your own title however you want. But I just think it confuses the issue.
Well, we talked about a brief overview of Mormonism, some of the distinctive differences, and I want to know a little bit about, we talked about like Latter-day Saints, but what is RLDS? Where do they fit into the picture, the restored Latter-day Saints?
What happened in 1844, Joseph Smith was killed in a gun battle at the Carthage jail. He had a couple of pistols smuggled in. He ends up getting killed along with his brother Alvin in 1844. He had been in jail because of destroying a printing press that was put together. The newspaper Nauvoo Expositor was put together by disgruntled former Mormons who did not like Joseph Smith's polygamy. Joseph Smith had between 30 and 40 wives, marrying most of them secretly, marrying other men's wives, teenagers as young as 14. That's all historical. A lot of Latter-day Saints didn't really know that until the last few years when the church came out and admitted to it in an essay on their website. So as far as the religion having a place where it could have just ended, but there were still people who wanted to follow somebody. And Brigham Young actually came out as the strongest candidate. There were several others, Sidney Rigdon and a few others, who debated as to, who should be the top leader. Brigham Young pretty much got the majority of the people. He ends up moving the people out in the fall of 1846 and made their way to Utah. They get here in July of 1847. But left behind was Joseph Smith's wife, Emma, and her children. And Joseph Smith did not leave a good contingency plan. If he were to die, who should take over? So Brigham Young did win out there, but Emma wanted nothing to do with Brigham Young. She did not like him. And so they basically started their own church. It was known as the Reorganized Church of the Latter-day Saints. That took place a few years later. They made their home in Independence, Missouri, where they're at today. That religion later became known as the Community of Christ. But the idea that which one is the true follower of Joseph Smith, there are lots of churches. I mean, even Warren Jeffs, who was the founder, or not the founder, but he was the president for many years of the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints in here in Utah, and he's in jail now because he had married 70 some odd women, including teenagers, and got himself into trouble that way. He's in jail for forever. But we have literally several hundred splinter groups. They just happen to be one. Today, the Community of Christ, the old RLDS, is very New Age in thought. Consider the most liberal Protestant denomination you can think of. They're just like that. They believe in homosexuality. They believe in many of them are atheists. In fact, they cater to the atheists to come to their church, which is fascinating. But very much progressive, if you want to call them progressive, feminism, all of that. And so they are today based in Independence still. but they maybe have a couple 100,000 people, and they're not a missionary-minded people as the Latter-day Saints are, except in Africa. For whatever reason, they are very much a missionary church when it comes to Africans.
Wow, that's wild. And a side note there, you mentioned how, they've got multiple wives and the issues with the leaders that are undeniable. What do Mormons say when you talk about Joseph Smith and his history of various things like polygamy? Are they okay with that?
I'm going to say that there has been a mass exodus out of the LDS church in the last 10 years, and a lot of it has to do with Joseph Smith. They don't like his polygamous ways, which many of them, like I said, did not know before the church admitted to this. They don't like the fact that he translated the Book of Abraham, supposedly, a book that we have the papyrus to. It was rediscovered in the 1960s, and that papyrus is not even close to what he has translated as the Book of Abraham. Upon my hand, Abraham said, "This is my hand that I'm writing on papyrus." Well, it wasn't. It was just a common funeral papyri. A lot of Latter-day Saints have left over that. So for a lot of people now, Joseph Smith cannot be rejected in this church. You could reject Jesus before you could ever reject Joseph Smith. While they don't worship him, he is the centerpiece, and they give testimony to him on the first Sunday of every month. They'll give their testimony in church, and it always has Joseph Smith's name in there. So I like to say that Joseph Smith is either the greatest man on earth, he really was true, or he was the biggest con man there ever was. You have to make a decision. But when you take a look at the evidence and you see what Joseph Smith was all about, he was definitely a con man. He was a false teacher. The Bible teaches us in 1 John 4:1 to watch out for false prophets, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. He's teaching contrary to what the Bible teaches. I don't like to necessarily, when I'm in a conversation with a Latter-day Saint, say mean things about Joseph Smith, but when it comes down to brass tacks, I have to say Joseph Smith, he could have been a great teacher if he was true, and then I would want to become a Mormon, but I'm not a Mormon because I think everything that he says is false.
You mentioned a couple of their books, The Pearl of Great Price, the Book of Mormon. They use the Bible. Forget what the other one was.
Doctrine and Covenants. Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Right.
okay. Do they see contradictions between the various ones? I mean, if the Book of Mormon is teaching something contrary to what the Bible says, what do they just go with the more recent revelation? And what are their higher authorities? Would the church have authority as well in the average mind of the Mormon?
You have to understand that this church is built on supposed revelation, and revelation are their four standard, what they call the standard works, the four works that you just mentioned. And then also they have living prophets and apostles. So right now we have 97-year-old Russell M. Nelson, who is the leader of this church, and what he says pretty much goes. He has two counselors. Those three men are called the First Presidency, and then there are 12 apostles under them. That those 10 men are the top general authorities. And then there are other general authorities who are called 70s. They meet twice a year in Salt Lake City at the conference center. And what they do there is they teach doctrine. So very much so what their leaders are teaching is probably the most important. But they do believe probably of the four, the Book of Mormon. In fact, Joseph Smith said it was the most correct book on earth. And a man could get near to God by abiding by its precepts than by any other book. The question you ask, if that is brought up by a Latter-day Saint, is which precepts are you talking about? And they will usually say faith, repentance, and baptism. Well, doesn't the Bible teach that? Now, see, they'll use the Bible. Don't get me wrong. They do use the Bible. But again, they have a little asterisk next to it. It's true, according to Joseph Smith, as far as it is translated correctly. And that word translated correctly really means transmitted correctly. They don't know how we got our Bible. They think somehow corrupt priests got in there and changed things. And so there are things that Joseph Smith was able to fix. It's called the inspired version, although it's not an official version of the church. They don't use it officially, but they still use it. And then also the Book of Mormon. And the Doctrine and Covenants is also important because it has modern teachings. But you're right. They do contradict each other. I mean, it's interesting. We have a verse called in the end of the Book of Mormon, Moroni 8:18, and it says that God is an unchangeable God. It's what is taught in the Bible. The Bible teaches that God hasn't changed. Malachi 3:6, we have Psalm 90 verse 2, that God is from everlasting to everlasting. And so actually, Moroni 8:18 fits more with Christianity than it would with Mormonism, which teaches, this is a little couplet that was created by the fifth president of the church, Lorenzo Snow, as man is, God once was, as God is, man may be. And the idea in Mormonism is that as we are today, as man is, God once was, he lived in another realm. They won't tell you much about it because there's not a lot written about this, but that he has a body of flesh and bones. This is what Doctrine and Covenants, section 130, verse 22 says. So the Bible teaches, well, no, God has is spirit and must be worshipped in spirit and truth. That's what John 4 says. And so the idea that God was once a man and that we, as God is, man may become, have the potential then to be able to become as God is. Man, that's so different than what the Bible teaches. So a lot of times you're going to have to do some picking and choosing, because there are verses, because I mentioned Doctrine and Covenants, section 130, verse 22, which says that God has this body of flesh and bones. And yet it says in Doctrine and Covenants, section 20, that he is eternally God. So how do you reconcile that? Well, Joseph Smith was in a transition form from the time he starts to write in 1830 till the time he dies in 1844. He's always changing his mind.
Yeah, so I was wondering, Eric, over the years that you've been witnessing to Mormons, I've heard other people who have ministries who do something similar to what you do, saying that, and you've hinted at this throughout the interview, that, you know, the original idea is that Joseph Smith claimed that, you know, it was originally revealed to him that all religious denominations were believing in correct doctrines, and that it was his job kind of to restore the true church. But I've heard people say that over the years, it seems like it's harder to get Mormons to engage in conversation, and that they're not as interested in defending kind of the original truths, if you will, what they believe are truths of Mormonism. Has that been your experience as well?
Yeah, you can never assume what a Latter-day Saint believes. I think a mistake a lot of Christians who are well-meaning make is they will tell the Latter-day Saint what he or she believes based on their study. And they're accurate if you want to go back to the earlier leaders and maybe even their current leaders. But you can't assume that the Latter-day Saint you're talking to is believing all of that. And you're right, I'm going to say in the last 5 to 7 years especially, and we've got postmodernism, of course. We've got people who come up with their own brand of things, and that's always been the case, but even more so. But especially in this progressive age, you know, I mean, all the social issues, feminism and homosexuality and other things as well. A lot of Latter-day Saints are calling themselves Latter-day Saints, but rejecting what their leaders teach on these topics. And so I always like to ask questions when I'm talking to the Latter-day Saint. Well, what's your view about God? Where did God come from? Was he once a man? And let them kind of define that for you. What's your view? If you were to die right now, where would you go? And they always will say, oh, I'm not sure. I hope I'll go to the celestial kingdom. But okay, let's say you're good enough to get there, because you have to basically reach perfection. Tell me a little bit about that. Are you going to become worshiped? Are your children going to worship you? And it's just interesting to hear what they have to say. You can do that, I think, in a way that can be very, I think, sound and communicate what truth is, where they're at rather than where they're not at. So you're right. You can't just go up to somebody and say, well, yeah, you guys believe in Adam God, because Brigham Young did teach that in Journal of Discourses, Volume 1, page 50 and 51. He taught that very clearly, and he also taught that he never taught any doctrine that wasn't true. Okay, well, he did teach that, but that would be a mistake to think that Latter-day Saints believe that today. But while I say all of that, what I like to do, especially with current teaching, what they might have just taught at General Conference the previous year, because I keep up with this, is when they say something that is contrary to what their leaders have said, I'll say, well, that's interesting, because, you know, last year, one of your apostles said blah, blah, blah. And do you think he's not telling the truth? This especially comes true, guys, when I'm out on the street. I like to give out a book called The Miracle of Forgiveness. And I talk about that in Introducing Christianity to Mormons.
Yes.
This book has been so beneficial. I was just at the BYU football game on Saturday and handing out copies of the book to the students who are going to this football game. I love talking to students because they don't have the book. This book was written in 1969. And what I like to do, they're not sure what to do with me because this was a very popular book. Millions of copies sold. In fact, the book was recommended at General Conference back in the day for every Latter-day Saint to read this. So here I am handing out one of their own books. The question I get all the time is, you're not even a Latter-day Saint. Why are you handing out the book? And I say, well, I disagree with pretty much everything that Spencer Kimball says, but I think what he was doing was a good job of explaining what your scriptures teach. And I like to call him Nike before there was such a thing as Nike. Nike teaches, just do it. Well, that's what Spencer Kimball said. Spencer Kimball was accurate. He cites from the scriptures that say that God doesn't give commandments that cannot be kept, that perfection is an achievable goal, that trying is not sufficient. You must do rather than not do. In fact, Yoda was probably patterned after him. If you go on the internet and look up at Spencer W. Kimball, he had the ears and the facial of, and some would say Yoda, but it's not try, it's do. And that's what his book is all about. So even though a lot of Latter-day Saints I talk to, when I try to hand that out, say, I reject that book. And then that's great for me, because then I say, oh, so you would call him a false prophet. Well, I wouldn't call him a false prophet, but is he giving false teaching? Well, yeah, he's giving false teaching. They're not understanding how they're contradicting themselves. Either he was a true prophet or he was not a true prophet. He was a 12th prophet back in the 1980s. And so I use that in a way so they might not agree with Spencer W. Kimball, because some of them hate the book, because he does have a section in there against homosexuality. And that right now is not a kind thing that people think we're not supposed to talk against, but he did.
It's safe to say that in the same way, postmodernism, progressivism, and feminism, and the many other isms have unfortunately infected some of the pockets of the Christian church. They've also infected the pockets of Mormonism.
Big time.
Yeah.
Back 7 years ago, they had a series of essays, 13 essays called the Gospel Topics Essays, 13 of them that dealt with everything from Joseph Smith's polygamy, the Book of Abraham, and a few other issues like that. It really shocked a lot of people. People were leaving more for doctrinal or historical reasons. But this book here came out called The Next Mormons, and I'm not trying to promote it, but Jana Reese is a Mormon blogger. It's published by Oxford Press. She did surveys and that were real life surveys. I mean, these were solid surveys, did all the research. It costs a lot of money to do those. She discovered that people are still leaving because of history or doctrine, but they're leaving more because the church isn't filling their needs. They disagree with the prophet on some of the things that he talks about with homosexuality. I'm going to say homosexuality and feminism are the two big issues right now why people are leaving. I was just talking to a former Latter-day Saint just a couple of months ago at the bookstore, and I asked why she left. She says, I left because I don't like their teaching on homosexuality. Well, what am I supposed to do with that? That's a bad reason, I think, to leave the church. I think you should leave the church because it's not true, not because you disagree with their teaching on that. But that was why she left. And so that's made it harder for us out on the streets, because I can deal with doctrine and I can deal with history. But when I get into personal opinions, why you're so mean-spirited to think that God didn't create people the way they are, and abortion's not okay, or feminism. That's a big one right now, because there's a lot of feminists in the church. See, Mormonism does not allow the priesthood for men or for women, but only for men. And a lot of women are trying to get that priesthood. It's called the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood. You get the Aaronic when you're 12. You get the Melchizedek when you're 18 as a boy. And those priesthoods would give you the authority to be called elders. So the Mormon missionary males are called elders. That bothers a lot of women. They want the same authority. Well, in Christianity, we do have that. We call it a royal priesthood. Women do have the priesthood. They're one in Christ, and they have a personal relationship with Christ. They have the ability to go directly to Jesus. And also another thing that bothers the feminists is you're not supposed to pray to Mother God. Mormonism does have a Mother God, but it's not really talked about. In fact, the scriptures, their 4 scriptures do not mention the Mother God once. But they want to pray to Mother God. Well, the church has very clearly said you're not allowed to pray to Mother God, only Heavenly Father. Well, there are a lot of rebellious feminists. I was talking to one just recently who said, I will pray every day to Heavenly Mother against their leader's wishes.
Fascinating.
Well, before I ask my next question, I have to say that I Googled Spencer Kimball and looked at an image, and yes, he does look like Yoda. This is confirmed. So yeah, maybe we'll link to that in the show notes so everybody can see. But wow, that's really interesting.
What did he say? He said, "Do not try, do," or something. Isn't that one of the lines?
Do or do not. There is no
there
try.
It is. Yeah, yeah. So,
Yes.
a lot of people, because he wrote that in 1969, and Star Wars doesn't come out for another decade. So, yeah, interesting.
You live in Utah, and you actively reach out to Latter-day Saints. You've mentioned going door to door. You mentioned being at the football games and handing out books and such.
Mm-hmm.
What do typical outreaches look like, and how do you go about that? Because I'm really wondering how open most Latter-day Saints are. Are they set in their beliefs? Are they open to examining their beliefs? How easy are those conversations? How do they respond? I mean, because, let's say a Jehovah's Witness comes to someone's door, they might just slam the door in their face. And I'm wondering if you get that sort of same treatment. Oh, here comes the Christians,
I've talked to a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses, and it's so frustrating because when you get anywhere, all of a sudden they look at their watch and they have to leave. It's not the same with Latter-day Saints. I get into great conversations even today. And so Mormons are generally nice people. They're friendly. They're not going to want to fight you or anything for trying to share your faith. Going door to door, you mentioned. I find going door to door in Utah the easiest state in the world to actually do door to door because they've all been on missions and they understand where you're at. So they're very friendly, generally speaking, of course. But just being able to there's different kinds of outreaches. There's not one way to do it. I want to make that very clear, too. Some people think, well, give me the formula or the question I need to ask that will get a Latter-day Saint to convert. And I always told people before our book, Sharing the Good News with Mormons, came out in 2018, I always said, well, you write that book and you write the one question that I'll be able to use because there's not one question. But that book I mentioned from 2018, Sean McDowell and I put that together with 24 other chapters in there that are different ways of doing it. One of my favorite ways, well, I just told you about the miracle of forgiveness, but I like to go to temple open house outreaches. They're building temples like crazy right now. The leader of the church, Nelson, in 4 years has announced 120 temples, and they only have 172 right now, and he's announced 120. They're building them like crazy. These are special places where Latter-day Saints can do work for themselves for not only this life, but for eternity. And also they can do work on behalf of the dead. That's why genealogy is so important. But I like to go to the different places in the United States where they have this, stand outside and get into conversations with people. And I want people who are not Latter-day Saints to understand that this is not a Christian religion. As nice as it looks inside their beautiful building, and they have pictures of Jesus everywhere, this is not a Christian religion. And then get into conversations with Mormons. So that's one of my favorite tactics. They haven't been opening them up in the last few years, but they're going to start next year. It's going to be crazy because they're going to be opening them up 4 and 5 a month, I think.
Eric, I wanted to ask you, in my past conversations with Mormons, when the discussion will turn to evidence, they kind of often punt to, now they don't typically call it this, but what's historically been known as the burning in the bosom that they receive from the Holy Ghost when they ask him if the Book of Mormon's true. And that's of course based on Moroni 10:4-5. Mm-hmm. And I've addressed that, kind of a number of different ways. And but I was wondering, when that comes up in conversation, when you're talking with Mormons and they just punt, if you're pointing out, for example, if the Book of Abraham is a fraud, or Joseph Smith made false prophecies, or, some of the other issues, and they just kind of punt to, well, I prayed about it and I know it's true. Where's the best way? What's the best direction to take with that?
I think that we need to make it clear that we're not a people that crosses the street without looking both ways. See, we want to lay out truth. We want to be able to dissect it and compare it to what else is out there. It's called inference to the best explanation. Take the best information you have and lay it out. Well, when we take a look at Mormonism and we see how it distorts what biblical teaching is, when we take a look at the life of Joseph Smith and see the problem with that, when we see and understand that Mormonism is another gospel that's talked about in Galatians chapter 1, what did Paul say about that? Let anyone who preaches a gospel other than the one I preached to you, let him be accursed. And it says in 2 Corinthians 11:4, it's possible to have a false Jesus. Now, you should not be scared to investigate your own faith. If you have the truth, then it's going to pan out in the end. My friend Peter Barnes was Jehovah's Witness for 30 years before he passed away, and he became a Christian. But he used to tell people, error will always run from truth, but truth will never run from error. And I think there's something about that saying that is so true. You need to investigate. You need to read and see where your religion came from. But what I would even more highly recommend is, do you believe the Bible is true? And most Latter-day Saints will say, yes, I do. Well, would you read the New Testament? Just read it all the way through with no presuppositions. Just read it as it is. And you should be not scared of that. In fact, they're studying the Old Testament right now in a curriculum called Come Follow Me. Every week they're supposed to be, right now they're in Daniel. They're reading through the Old Testament, and they're doing these exercises in their curriculum. You should be willing to read and see if what it is teaching is the same as what your leaders are teaching, what Joseph Smith had taught. And I'm going to tell you, that test right there has had a tremendous effect. So many people. In fact, the guy who wrote my foreword, Michael Wilder, he was a Mormon missionary back in 2005, and a pastor told him to read the Bible like a little child. He did. He read the New Testament 20 times during his mission. Instead of reading the Book of Mormon like most of the missionaries did, he was reading the New Testament. He becomes a Christian. He's saved by grace through faith. He believes Jesus is God. And the week before he's supposed to be released on his 2 years, he's 21 years old. He's going to give this talk, and he does. And they said, "Are you serious?" At the end, they pulled him aside. "We're kicking you out of here." They sent him home a week early. And you can read his story, Passport to Heaven. It's an incredible story. But he's not the only one. So many people have become Christians through reading the Bible only. And so I challenge Latter-day Saints. I give away copies of the New Testament all the time. And I say, would you be willing to read this? Read the book of Romans. I actually, on our website, mrm.org, it's called Take the Book of Romans Challenge. Would you be willing to read the book of Romans and see what it has to say versus what you have been taught? I've gotten Latter-day Saints to do that. It has an effect. And you can crawl back into that, well, I prayed about it and I know it's true. And a lot of Latter-day Saints don't want to investigate because I think they're scared of what will happen when they open that Pandora's box. But if it's true, it's going to be found to be true when you do that further investigation. If it's not true, then I think a faith that's false is not a faith not worth having. You need to have faith in what is true.
Amen. Yeah. One of the things I've done with Mormons who I've talked to at my door is when I've brought up some of my objections to Mormonism, and they, like I said, I feel like they're punting to that, you know, pray over it and the Holy Ghost will show you it's true. As I say, well, I've had an experience with God. You've had an experience with God. So at best right now we're in a stalemate. So where can we look to see which experience is valid? Because there are forces other than just God out there, on my view. And so that, at least I hope, gets them thinking of like, yeah, we've got to look beyond just the experience.
I like that, Chad. I love what you just said. I think that is so true, because you can compare testimony to testimony, and you're right. Where do we go from here? I mean, you got a testimony and you believe what's true. I have one, but it's contrary to what your testimony is as far as my beliefs. So where do we go from here? That's where I think you challenge them with the Bible. The Bible says in 1 Thessalonians 5:21 to test everything. And I already cited 1 John 4:1, test the spirits to see if they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. They're not going to come trying to pass off $30 counterfeits. They're going to try to make the 20 look as good as possible. But we've been given tests to be able to determine if that bill is genuine or not. And if it's a false gospel, then it ought to be rejected.
Amen. Well put.
Now, Eric, you've written or co-written like 5 or 6 different books about Mormonism. You mentioned the one with Sean McDowell, one with Bill McKeever, for example. Yeah. And this one, the most recent one, Introducing Christianity to Mormons, you spent a couple years writing on your own. And it's written as a reference tool for people who like to share Christianity with Mormons, but don't quite know how to do it, talking in their own language. You use their own terminology and kind of approach it from the mindset that Latter-day Saint would understand. And it's also something that you can give to Mormons as well. which is great. I would say that makes it unique among Christian books that address Mormonism. What was your other motivations for writing this, and what do you think it makes it unique?
Well, my daughter came to me in this office where I'm sitting right now in my basement of my home, and she had a friend who had left the Mormon church. You have to understand, 45% of everybody who leaves Mormonism heads toward atheism, agnosticism, or nothing at all. Another 22% call themselves just Christian. That's 2 out of 3 people who want nothing to do with any other kind of religion, just because just Christian means they're moral people. Only 1/3 go to some other kind of religion. And of the total, 10% become evangelical Christians. So my daughter said, this woman at my work is asking me for something to read that would help her to better understand what it is what we as Christians believe. Do you have a book like that? Well, there are great books written. Cold Case Christianity, written by my friend J. Warner Wallace. The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. There's a lot of books that do a pretty good job of that, but nothing what she was asking for. And I joked with my daughter and said, I think that's a book that needs to be written. And then I didn't realize I was assigning myself homework for the next couple of years. But the purpose of this book is to be able to not just show how Mormonism is wrong. I do believe Mormonism is wrong, and we have other books that you mentioned that help us to explain that. I'm more interested instead of showing how Christianity is true when compared to Mormonism. And I want to correct those straw man arguments that Mormons have. For the Trinity, for instance, they don't grasp that at all, and they think that's a three-headed God. They ask the question, who was Jesus praying to in the Garden of Gethsemane? And the answer is easy. He was praying to the Father. They're separate persons, but they don't get that. They think, well, he was God and he was God, so who's he talking to? Or salvation by grace through faith. They don't get that concept. They think that we as Christians believe we just go at church and raise our hand when the preacher says, come up forward, and then I can go commit murder and adultery. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. And I'll say, where did you get that from? Well, isn't that what you believe? Because, easy believism, or one term that's been used is called gracer. No, we're not gracers. We're saved by grace through faith. This is not of ourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, lest any man should boast. But verse 10 of Ephesians 2 goes right in and says, for we are God's workmanship, created by Christ Jesus to do good works, which he prepared in advance for us to do. So that counters their citation of James chapter 2, verse 20. Faith without works is dead. I agree with James. See, Christianity is not about what we do. It's about who we are. But who we are affects what we do. And that's what we call the gifts of the Spirit. We have love, joy, peace. We don't conjure that up on our own. That's something that only God can do. So, that's how this book is meant for Christians who want to share their faith. And it might be a good reminder for those who may not get a lot of doctrine at their churches, but also a book that I'm hoping people can hand to their Latter-day Saint friend who's willing to read it. I don't think this book ought to be forced on anyone, but would you like to learn a little more? I wrote it sensitively, not trying. I understand what offends Mormons, and I did my best to not needlessly offend, but to explain what it is we believe in comparison to what Mormonism teaches.
Yeah, one of the things I love about the book is that not only it's not your standard, here's what the Mormon believes, here's how to refute it. Yeah. Here's what the Mormon believes, here's how to refute it. Not only are you learning the key distinctions between Christianity and Mormonism and how to best communicate with the Mormon, to the gospel, but also the Christian who's reading it. And you hinted at this, the Christian who's reading it is almost getting not almost, they are getting an education of how to defend kind of the central tenets of their faith, which I love because, like you said, in a lot of our churches, we're not doing that. We're not equipping people to do that. And so I love how it's kind of a multi-purpose book. And I love that about it.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate that. One of my favorite parts of the book, and I don't know if somebody has read it all, there might be a favorite place they have. My favorite place is the glossary of usage of terms that are used in the appendix. I had to fight with the publisher to put that in because the book was a little longer than they wanted it to be. And they were not, do you really need to have that? Yeah, I want that in there. And so what I do, the first time the word is used, I italicize it. And that tells you to go back there and you get the definition. But a lot of the terms, if you go to that appendix, you're going to see that grace, you're going to see 2 definitions. One's Christian, one's LDS. That way, I'm trying to show you how difficult this is unless you know that grace, according to Mormonism, is the ability to keep the commandments, that's what Mormonism teaches. Well, for us, it's a complete gift. So I contrast the two ideas there and show those differences. I'm hoping that will be a helpful tool along with the 10 chapters that we have there.
Well, I say here for fighting to get that in there, because that's one of the great points you make in the book that I want listeners to definitely, if you don't get anything else out of this, that you've got to make sure you define your terms when you're talking with Mormonisms, because Mormons, because when they say God, when they say Jesus, when they say salvation, they mean very different things than what historic Christianity does.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Eric, I'm not going to ask you for the ultimate question to convert every Mormon, like you referenced earlier, but when the Mormon comes to our door and they're there to engage us in discussion, and let's say somebody's listening right now and they've never done that before, what are some important things? I know we talked a little bit about defining terms, but what are some important things, maybe a list of 2 or 3 things for us to keep in mind when we're talking with Mormons?
Number one, let them do the talking. Greg Kokel in his book Tactics shows, use the Columbo tactic. Just one more question, and so you ask questions, you get them to talk, you let them play the offense. Well, where'd you get that from? Just curious, and being kind. I think that's another thing. So many Christians call themselves Christians and slam the door in their face. In fact, I was talking to another guy yesterday at the bookstore who went on his mission, and he talked about he went down south apparently, and so a lot of Christians there, and they call themselves Christians, and bad examples. And so we need to have that good example. You're not going to necessarily win somebody in one visit, but maybe you can plant some seeds. So asking questions, maybe giving your testimony as you were talking about, Chad, and say, well, that's great. You have a testimony. So do I. Can I tell you about how Jesus changed my life? I think that's another way to do that. But in fact, Sandra Tanner writes in our book, Sharing the Good News with Mormons, she writes a chapter about how to deal with missionaries. It's a good chapter. I would encourage people to read that as well. I think just making sure that you have the right motivation. Ephesians 4 says we're supposed to speak the truth in love. And a lot of people forget that last part.
I like that. So let them talk, ask lots of thoughtful questions, be kind, share your testimony.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think those are good.
All right.
That's a good list there.
Well, Eric, we've really enjoyed the interview and the time has flown. I want to point people to resources online. Your book, Introducing Christianity to Mormons. More information about that book can be found at introducingchristianity.com. And then a lot of resources also can be found at Mormon Research Ministry, MRM.org. Of course, your daily radio program, Viewpoint on Mormonism, your newsletter that you write for called Mormonism Research. We'll link to all those in the show notes. Now, as promised, I did have a final question about The Chosen. Season 3 of The Chosen is coming out later November, and there was a trailer that has dropped. And so I don't know if you've seen this, Eric, but there's this one part in the trailer where the Pharisees come to Jesus and they say, hey, if you don't stop doing what you're doing, we're going to have to go to the law of Moses here. And he says, I am the law of Moses.
Yeah.
So that was cool. And then someone online somewhere said, this is just Mormonism. They've gotten this right from the Book of Mormon, and maybe just really worried about Mormon influences in this program. But is that anywhere to be found in the Book of Mormon? Do you think there's Mormon influences in that?
I'm going to be honest. I don't think that was a Mormon influence. Yes, it's found in the Book of Mormon. That there is that very idea. But as somebody else has pointed out, Charles Spurgeon actually used the same idea. And you can get really deep and try to nuance it all, try to figure out what was being said. What I do have a problem with, though, and I'm not against The Chosen. I've seen the first 2 seasons. Watch them all the way through. We're very concerned because Angel Studios is based here in Utah. They were using the LDS Church's set, the dramatic set that's here in Utah. And so we've been very concerned, and we haven't seen anything in the first 2 seasons. But I'm bothered by Dallas Jenkins. For instance, he had a video back in May where he was criticizing people who criticized him for the Mormon influence. And he said that the LDS folks are brothers and sisters in Christ, and they love the same Jesus that I do. He actually said that. And he stands by my statement that those LDS friends that I'm referring to absolutely love the same Jesus that I do. I think at best that's naive, at worst that's deceptive. And so my problem isn't so much, it's a dramatic series and they take a lot of liberties. I don't have a problem with that. I'm okay with drama, and I'm okay with a little bit of licensing, perhaps to get you to think through. The Chosen is fine. I'm just I have a problem by involving, using their set. It's the borrower becomes servant to the lender, and just so you know, this past week, you can look this up. They hired somebody who graduated from BYU, a Latter-day Saint, and there's going to be a feature movie. I think it's on Job. And it's going to go out in theaters in 2023, the fall of 2023. I don't know much about it except for the news piece that I read, but Angel Studios, that bothers me because, it's Job. It's not the New Testament, but still, what kind of influence could be coming through inadvertently? And that's why I think people were so quick to jump on the Law of Moses. I understand the concern. I personally am not so concerned with that, but I am concerned with more going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. So maybe there's not something directly in the show that you've seen so far, but there is reason to be watchful.
And I have watched both seasons very closely, and I haven't had a problem with really anything. I didn't see any Mormonism in there, but I haven't seen I've only heard about what you're talking about with this Law of Moses, and I don't think that most Latter-day Saints would not say that Jesus is the Law of Moses. That's just a unique thing. I think Dallas Jenkins loves being creative. I think that maybe sometimes can be a killer too. Being too creative could get you in trouble. And whether or not he knew that is actually used in the Book of Mormon, it is. So I don't know. How are they going to deal with that? If I were him, I probably would just take that part out just to avoid any confusion there. That's probably what I would do, but I doubt they will.
Well, thanks for your insights in that, Eric. I appreciate that. And is there anything else you'd want to add or point people to before we say goodbye?
Well, we have our website, mrm.org. We have our podcast, as you mentioned, Viewpoint on Mormonism. We have shows going back 11 years you can listen to. And I have a special website, introducingchristianity.com. And that will take you to our website, but it has a lot of bells and whistles. I have questions at the end of each of the chapters. I deal with those on that website. And also all the podcasts. So you guys will have a link to this podcast there, because that right now is the best way to promote this book, is not going traveling all over the country. It's talking to people like you in the comfort of my own office. Thank you for having me on, guys. I appreciate it so much.
Oh, yes. Thank you for coming on. It was great.
Been a real pleasure, and God bless. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.